the last lesson, hard to believe that topic 1 is almost done. Lesson 5, how should the treaty be viewed? And actually, in this case, how should the treaties more broadly be viewed? Because they can all fall similarly into the same light. Now, this lesson is more of an overview of what people have said about the treaty and how that opinion of the treaty has evolved, both in favor of the treaty and against the treaty. The first thing I need to mention is a notion that you'll become very familiar with if you stay with history for any length of time. It's a notion of historiography. And historiography is an incredibly important element about being a historian. Historiography is, simply put, all of the writing and all of the opinions on a subject that historians have put forward and how those opinions have been shaped, how they are different, and why they are different. It's really important to know the historiography of your topic so that you can contribute in a positive way to the historical dialogue. You contribute to the arguments that historians are making about why this happened or who's responsible for this, et cetera, et cetera. And the treaty, of course, is a very, very rich topic in historiography because so many historians have been perplexed about this treaty. Was it good? Was it fair? Was it terrible? Did it start the Second World War? Is the claim that of Hitler that the treaty was responsible for his actions in the 1930s, is that justified, et cetera, et cetera? So you can see just on those notes why so many people would want to look into the treaty. A couple notes on historiography, and now this is a quite complex thing, but in a very, very simple form, the closer you are to a time, the likely you are to be affected more directly by the emotional impact of the event. And the emotional impact of the event could have potentially large impacts on your perspective. And oftentimes, the closer you are to an event, the more powerful the criticism you will have. Not to mention the fact that if you're influenced by an event, it will be very hard to see things from an entirely different perspective because, of course, you feel an emotional attachment having been affected by that particular event. Obviously, the sort of talk about the Treaty of Versailles and the First World War ending is really clouded by the Second World War. Of course, we know what happens. And we know that the treaty was, in some small way, maybe in some big ways, depending on how you view it, responsible for the terrible war that followed. And it's linked, perhaps even too easily, to the treaty. And as a result, we tend to think that the treaty is terrible because there's a connection between the treaty and what people thought was unimaginable, a second global war of disastrous proportions. So historians have to approach these topics very carefully, and when they re-examine events, especially a long time after, their accuracy and how, what type of evaluation they can give benefits from a lack of emotional attachment, rigorous modern scholarship. Of course, historians are always working to perfect their craft, and if someone does it better one day, then everybody should do it better thereafter, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, information availability. The longer you have to research things and the more information becomes available. There are, things that are available to us today because of the internet, which means that, historians in some cases would have to go to Paris. Or maybe that was unattainable for them, or they were afraid of flying, or I don't know, whatever the stupid reason, to get the information on the Treaty of Versailles. Now most of it's on the internet in archives. So you can actually, if you wanted to read the actual copies of the Treaty of Versailles, you can do it in your bedroom. You can do it on the toilet on your mobile phone, to be a little bit crass, but you get the picture. Things are easier today, and therefore more information. So we benefit from a more complete understanding the further away we are from an event. So what was the perception of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919? Obviously, pretty shortly afterwards, there were several harsh critics, and these harsh critics, especially cartoonists and stuff. I would even say that cartoonists who wrote about the treaty had really an undue impact, because when you think about the treaty, we think of all of these cartoons, such as the one on the right, of the German person being squeezed and then forced to swallow a poison pill known as the peace treaty. These things were all over the place, and these really shape, especially because we show them to kids because they're easy to understand, really shape our perceptions of these things. Left-wing cartoonists produced these cartoons, and they've been seen ever since. And they really, I believe, distorted our perception of the Treaty of Versailles. We generally think most people hated it. One of the additional difficult parts of the treaty was the fact that one of the most famous economists of all time, working with the British attachment at the Treaty of Versailles and working directly with David Lloyd George, a man by the name of John Maynard Keynes, who will become very famous by inventing what is known as Keynesian economics. And that, if you want to know what that is, I'm happy to tell you what that is in class, but that's not for today. He wrote a very critical book called The Economic Consequences of Peace that was published later in 1919. He was harsh on the peacemakers, particularly David Lloyd George, and somewhat predicted, I guess, the future conflict, that is World War II. And again, though his views come to perhaps isn't quite as balanced as it need to be. Of course, he was attached to it. He was affected by it. And of course, he is very emotional about what he thought about the treaty. This book has really come to shape our perceptions of the treaty. Now, it's interesting to say that these sort of famous portrayals of the treaty have come out because at the time, despite German complaints and those sympathetic to Germany, a lot of people felt that this was a really good treaty. Britain and France mostly liked it, even though both will admit it wasn't perfect. Both will admit that the treaty didn't give them all of what they wanted. Generally speaking, they thought the treaty was okay. And most people, if you were to ask them in 1919, would feel these two things. Number one, they would feel that the Germans, by saying the treaty is crazy, were operating a double standard. Think about it. They have punished Russia incredibly harshly in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and they demand fairer treatment for themselves. That's just not right. Versailles would put point for point against the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in which the Germans enforced on the Russians in 1917 and 1918, was much less harsh. Additionally, Germany's economic problems, well, these were partly self-inflicted. Germany didn't raise taxes to pay their debts. They could have, but they didn't. They didn't raise taxes to pay for the war. They could have, but they didn't. They had basically planned to take over all of Europe and use the money that they stole from a conquered France or a conquered Belgium or a conquered Russia to pay for the debts they incurred fighting this war. And they had fought this war thinking the entire time they were going to win and never making any preparations for the fact that they didn't. And certainly they didn't raise taxes, which could have been done to pay for the war, but they didn't do that. And as such, Germany ends up in a disastrous economic situation. The treaty makes it worse, but it was disastrous to begin with, perhaps. And the Treaty of Versailles obviously doesn't need to account for Germany's wartime stupidity. There are many modern perceptions of the Treaty of Versailles, and we can see that from today's perspective. You would think that, in light of what happened in World War II, that they would be really, really influenced by the Nazis and their perceptions of the treaty in World War II and its attachment to the treaty, but they're really not. They are influenced by it, but, not in the way you'd think. Historians have more generally recently pointed out that it wasn't as harsh as people point out. They thought, maybe being more generous would have been totally unacceptable at the time. Got to consider the populations of Britain and more particularly France. These people were devastated. They had lost a generation of their young men. And the peacemakers had a difficult job. They had to balance a public opinion that was terribly angry, and they had to balance this against, a need to make a fair and just peace that would create a better world. And maybe they did the best they could do under circumstances that most historians tend to think were pretty much impossible. No one was going to get what they wanted. And I think what's really important, and probably my favorite historian, not the least of which because she's Canadian, but other factors that are interesting about her, that is Margaret Macmillan. She's actually David Lloyd George's, the Prime Minister of Great Britain's granddaughter. And she writes a lot of famous books about the treaty. She wrote one on the peacemakers themselves and looking at the influence of personality, and she wrote one called Paris 1919, which is an overview of all of the treaties and how they were made. And her conclusion is generally this about the treaty. She basically says that the treaty is a good example of the old adage: what is true in history is sometimes less important than what is people believe to be true. And because people believed that the treaty was so unjust, they were able to manipulate it. But in reality, the treaty, from the 21st century perspective, from a modern perspective, when analyzed, wasn't too bad. Now let's look at a couple of Macmillan's conclusions, and I'll read them to you. You can read them yourself, but bear with me here. Macmillan writes, in recent years, a number of historians, myself included, have come to the conclusion that the German treaty was not as bad as it has been portrayed. Whatever the High Command later said, Germany had lost the war. It should have expected to lose territory. If Germany had won, it certainly would have taken territory from its defeated enemies. It should have expected that the Allies, and particularly France, would attempt to limit Germany's capacity to wage future wars. It should have expected to pay something, just as France had to pay after it lost the Franco-Prussian War. In fact, the German Foreign Ministry had worked out figures and drawn up schedules for the reparations it expected to be imposed on France. But with a treaty that was widely seen as unjust, and this was right across the political spectrum, there was little will in Germany to pay any reparations at all. The arguments between Germany and its former enemies, which poisoned international relations for so much of the decade after the war, obscured the fact that Germany never paid much in the end, probably less than a sixth of what it owed. Nevertheless, in Germany, reparations became shorthand for every economic problem, for unemployment, and for the dreadful inflation of the early 1920s. The real culprit was fiscal mismanagement by the German government, but that's not how it was perceived in Germany. Additionally, she adds a second important point that we need to consider when evaluating the treaty. And perhaps the treaty wasn't so bad, but she goes on to say that the enforcement of the treaty was terrible. In fact, that the treaty was manageable, but they didn't bother to enforce it. And she offers this up. She says, the final lesson which the Paris Peace Conference offers is that getting international agreements is one thing, enforcing them quite another. The Treaty of Versailles was a cumbersome document. It embodied a series of uneasy compromises among the powers, and it was unnecessarily irritating to the Germans. In the long run, though, the most important thing was that there was not sufficient will to enforce it among the winning nations. There were enforcement mechanisms in the treaty, but someone had to decide to use them. The French and the Belgians were willing, but they needed support from the British and perhaps the Americans, and that support was not there in the 1920s and the 1930s. From 1935 onwards, Hitler violated the provisions of the treaty, starting with the announcement that Germany had an air force and then moving troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, and he got away with it. And it is one of those big ifs in history, she says, he had been stopped early on, the Second World War in Europe might not have taken place. So interesting argument that she basically says that it wasn't the treaty, it was a lack of will to enforce the provisions of the treaty that could have potentially caused or saved us from the Second World War, had they been enforced. So those are the couple of opinions. We're going to examine this in a little bit more detail. You're going to have to come to your own opinion. So start thinking about these things now, and I hope this is giving you a little bit of food for thought. Not a long lesson, a nice way to end the unit, and I hope you enjoyed.